Hello everyone, this is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare, and today I am back with another knitting tutorial. So this one probably was one of my most requested videos in the comments of my last hat knit flat video. So I'll put a picture of that one up on the screen. So in that video, I showed you how to knit a ribbed beanie flat, right? So we knit it flat and then we seamed it up. In that video, I got quite a few questions about how to knit just a plain beanie, right? So this one just has the bottom ribbing, then kind of like that flat, what's called stockinette portion, decreases, and then bind off at the top. So what I've done in today's video is I've created this hat, and again, it is knit flat. So there's my seam. So what's great about this is that you don't need to know how to knit in the round. You don't even need to have circular knitting needles to work this project. And I show you each one of those steps along the way. So at the bottom, we're gonna start by casting on. Then we're gonna work a portion of ribbing. Then we're just gonna work the center portion of the hat, work our decreases, and then I'm gonna show you how to finish off at the top and create this hidden seam. Right, so my seam really is pretty hidden. That's it right there. You can really only see it on the inside of the hat. Then I added some pom-pom just as a bit of fun there. So down in the description box below, you're gonna find the full written version of the pattern. And this pattern is available in 4 sizes. So in just a second, I'll show you some of the samples demonstrating a few of the sizes. Then you're also gonna find links to all the materials I used to create my project. And you're gonna find each one of the video breakpoints. That way, if you wanna fast forward or rewind to any specific part of the video, you can find all the different time points down below. There'll also be a chapter bar along the bottom of the video telling you exactly where to go for each segment. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button. That way you stay up to date on all my future videos. Let's get started. Now before we begin, I just wanted to show you a few of the sizes available and how to read the pattern for each size. So first up, starting with the smallest one. So this one is the newborn size on here. So it's just this really precious little tiny hat. I think it's really quite adorable. Next up, there is a toddler size. I don't have a sample of that one. So let's skip to the next one. So next up is the adult small, or kind of like the teen size. This is the size I wear. It fits a head circumference between 20 inches and 21 inches. So I do get asked quite often how to measure what size hat you need. I find the easiest way is to just use a piece of string, wrap it around where like the hat ribbing would sit, and then just lay it flat and measure that piece of string. So that's the way I do it. So this is the size I wear. This is the teen or adult small. And then we also have one larger size here, which is the adult medium. And this pattern's really nice because if you wanted to, you can scale it up above this by just adding on an additional 10 stitches. Now in the pattern, the way the different sizes are identified is noted just below the table. So whenever there's a series of numbers, the first number is going to be the newborn size. Next up in parentheses is going to be the toddler size. Brackets is the adult small, and then the curly brackets is the adult medium. So if, for instance, down here at the cast on, I'm knitting the adult small size, so I always find it's easiest to just go through the pattern first and highlight all the numbers I need. So for the adult small, I'm looking for the number in brackets. So I'm gonna cast on 82 stitches. Then as I go through the rest of the pattern, I'm just gonna continue following each set of the numbers in the brackets. Now the last thing I wanted to mention is how you can modify this pattern to be different sizes. So let's say you wanted to go one size larger and make an adult large. So to do this, I would just add on an additional 10 stitches. So you can see the stitch counts in between each one is by 10. So I would cast on, let's say 102 stitches. Then the only parts of the pattern you're gonna have to modify is gonna be where we set up the decreases. So when you set up the decreases, you just wanna have an additional 2 stitches in between each set of stitch markers. So I hope that helps to clarify all the different sizes. And again, throughout this tutorial, I'm gonna be knitting this adult small size. So that's what all my numbers are gonna correspond to. The materials you need for this project include a US 6 and a US 7 knitting needle, and for this project you can use either circular knitting needles or straight knitting needles since they are knit flat. I prefer to use circular knitting needles, so that's what I'll be using here. 6 stitch markers, And the ones I've shown there are pre-made stitch markers. If you don't have any stitch markers already, you can always just use a little piece of yarn that you tie in a loop, a pair of scissors, and a tapestry needle. All the supplies I have here will be linked down below this video. So this is the yarn I'll be using for the project. So it's dye is cast, which is hand dyed here in Philly. It's called Squish worsted, and per skein you get 218 yards or 100 grams. And this is the Wintergreen colorway. So I just loved this colorway. It just reminded me of like winter and snow. So it's a white base with gray and then speckles of like a tealish blue. And I just think it is so pretty. So I was very excited to pick this up. I'll have dye is cast linked both at my local yarn shop, which is Loop, and then also the dye is cast website linked down below if you're curious about it. Now the first thing I need to do for this project is cast on. So the cast on method I'm going to be showing you today is a really quick and easy cast on method to use that's called the backward loop cast on. Now if you're looking for a more advanced cast on technique, check out some of my other videos that I'll have linked up above, where I show either the long tail cast on or the German twisted cast on. So for the backward loop cast on, what I have in front of me is first my smaller set of knitting needles, so my US 6, and then my yarn. And what I'm going to start by doing is creating a slip knot in my yarn. So when I create a slip knot for this cast on method, I don't need too long of what's called a yarn tail. So I just need about 8 to 10 inches unwound. And then I'm going to take my left hand and I'm going to lay it behind the yarn. So I essentially have what's called my tail closest to me and my ball of yarn further away from me. Now I'm going to grab onto this tail with the bottom 3 fingers of my left hand. Next up, I'm going to be grabbing onto my working yarn behind my finger. And I'm going to take this working yarn down below my finger, towards myself up the front, then back behind, down the bottom again, towards myself up to the front, back behind, down to the bottom. Now I'm going to grab onto this other strand with my bottom 3 fingers as well. So I always like to angle my hand now a little bit more, so it's kind of like pointed at a 45-degree angle here almost. And now to create the slip knot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange these top 2 loops on my finger. So first I'm going to take the second loop and I'm going to move it up closer to the tip of my finger so it becomes the new first loop. Now I'm going to take that new second loop, and again I'm going to pull that one up towards the tip of my finger so that one becomes the new first loop. Then I'm going to take that second loop in here again, and now I'm going to grab it, pull it off of my finger until a knot forms. So that is my slip knot. Now I want to take either one of my knitting needle points, and I want to have the point going over towards the left, and I'm just going to slide it right on to that piece of yarn, pull on my yarn tail to secure it on. So now my yarn is on my knitting needle, and that counts as my first stitch. Now the way I like to hold my knitting needle now is I'm going to grab onto my knitting needle, kind of like the base of it, with my right hand, and then I'm going to hold that first stitch in place with the pointer finger of my right hand. I also like to take the tail and hold that one in my right hand as well, just so I don't accidentally start casting on with that tail. So now the way the backward loop cast on is going to work is I'm going to lay my left hand behind that working strand of yarn. And again, I'm going to grab onto it with my bottom 3 fingers. Now I'm going to take my pointer finger, I'm going to go underneath the strand, towards myself, up the front, then go back behind that strand, down to the bottom again, towards myself, up to the top. Now it's essentially like I have like 1.5 loops around my finger now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my right knitting needle point, I'm going to go underneath that loop along my finger, slide that loop off of my finger and onto the knitting needle. And then I just tug on it gently to secure it in place. So you want it to be loose enough to where they can slide along the knitting needle and not so tight to where you can't barely move them at all. Now again, I'm going to put my hand behind that strand. I just removed my hand, so I have to reset it up again. I'm going to put my hand behind that strand, my left hand, grab onto it with my bottom 3 fingers, take my pointer finger underneath, towards myself, up to the top, back behind down to the bottom, towards myself, up to the top again. Now here I'm going to slide that loop off my finger onto the knitting needle. And this time I'm not going to let go of that strand. What I can do instead is I'm just going to take my pointer finger, again, go back behind, down to the bottom, up the front towards myself, slide it off my finger onto the knitting needle. So now I can just keep on wrapping my finger around the yarn and sliding the yarn right onto my knitting needle. So it becomes very easy to do this a little bit quicker. And now if I ever accidentally drop that strand, all I have to do is again just set it up again. So I'm going to take my left hand behind the strand, grab onto it with my bottom 3 fingers, go underneath the strand first, towards myself up the front, back behind, down to the bottom, towards myself up to the front. Then again, just begin sliding those loops off my finger onto the knitting needle. And depending on the size you're knitting, you need to cast on a different number of stitches. So all the number of stitch counts you'll need will be in the pattern down below. For the size I'm knitting, I'm going to cast on 82 stitches. And now when you go along your knitting needle and you count your stitches, that first slip knot does count as 1 stitch. So I'm going to keep on going along and cast on my number of stitches. So now I just finished casting on the number of stitches for the size I'm knitting. So what I want to do now is I want to take the knitting needle point that I just finished casting on all those stitches to and point it towards the right. Then I'm going to grab onto my other knitting needle with my right hand. So when I look at my knitting needles now, I have my knitting needle with my stitches on it being held in my left hand, and that's exactly where the working yarn is coming out of. And then I have my knitting needle with no stitches on it over here in my right hand. So these first few rows, we're going to be working the ribbing pattern. So the ribbing pattern is where we're going to alternate between knit 1 and purl 1. So as a quick refresher, how the knit stitches worked first is I'm going to take my right knitting needle into the base of the next stitch on my left knitting needle. I'm going to go into the front base of it, starting at the left, going over towards the right. Then I'm going to take my yarn, come up in between the 2 knitting needles, then pull it nice and snug, take my right knitting needle point and pull that loop through the stitch on my left knitting needle. Now I'm going to slide that stitch off my left knitting needle. Now for a purl stitch, I need my work to be in the front, so I'm going to take my working yarn in between my 2 stitches to the front of my work. And now I'm going to take my right knitting needle point into the base of the next stitch on my left knitting needle, and I'm going to go into that stitch going from right to left, right into the front base of it. Now I'm going to wrap my working yarn up to the back in between the 2 knitting needles, then down to the front. Now I'm going to push that loop through the stitch on my left knitting needle and slide the stitch off my left knitting needle. Now next up again, I would have a knit stitch. So for the knit stitch, I need my working yarn to be in the back. So I'm going to take my working yarn in between my 2 knitting needles to the back. Now again, for the knit stitch, I'm going to go into the base of the next stitch on my left knitting needle, go into the front base of it going from the left to the right, wrap my yarn around, so go back behind, up in between the 2 knitting needles, pull it nice and snug, then pull the loop through, slide the stitch off my left knitting needle. Next up I would have a purl, yarn in between to the front first, go into the base of the next stitch, going from the right to the left, wrap up back behind first, then down into the front, push that loop through, slide the stitch off my left knitting needle. So that is knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and I'm going to keep on alternating between those 2 stitches all the way across this row. And you want to make sure before you do any knit stitch, you're going to bring your working yarn to the back, work a knit stitch. Then for the purl stitch, you want to bring your working yarn to the front, purl the next stitch, bring your yarn to the back, knit the next stitch, and just keep on going all the way across. Working yarn to the front, purl one. And you'll know if you had the right number of stitches and that the pattern's correct if you finish this row with a purl stitch. Sometimes you gotta slide your stitches all the way up to the knitting needle point too, so they don't become too stretched out. So now I just finished going all the way across that first row, and I did just finish with a purl stitch. So I can tell it's a purl stitch because there's a little bump in front. Any stitches that I just purled should have those little bumps, and then the stitches that I just knit will be the flatter ones. So if I point with this instead, this flat one right here, that would be a knit stitch. This bump right next to it, that would be a purl stitch. Knit, purl bump, knit, purl bump. So it's a good way to read your knitting. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my work. So again, I want my knitting needle with my stitches on it, pointed over towards the right, and I'm going to hold on to that knitting needle with my left hand. And I'm going to take my free knitting needle that doesn't have any stitches on it over here in my right hand. Now again, as I go across this row, I'm going to work that exact same repeat. So I'm going to work knit one, purl one, all the way across. So the first stitch there, knit stitch, yarn to the front, purl one. And again, I'm going to continue going all the way across this row, knitting and purling each stitch. And as you're going, you want to check to make sure everything's lining up correctly. So when you're about to knit a stitch, you want to make sure that right below it is flat, right? So right below that doesn't have the bump. So that tells me I'm in the right place for a knit stitch. Now next up, this next stitch on my left knitting needle, right, has the bump in front. So I want to make sure I'm lining up my purl stitch right on top of it. So that is a great way to make sure all your knitting is going to line up. If you're ever in a situation where you're knitting right on top of a purl bump, that means somewhere it got offset in the previous section, so you need to go back and figure out where the mistake is. So now I just finished going across that second row, and now again, I'm just going to turn my work. So now the knitting needle with my stitches on it is pointed over towards the right. My free knitting needle is over here in my right hand. Now we want to continue working that ribbing row over and over again until it reaches the length specified in the pattern. So for my size, that's 1.5 inches. So I'm going to measure from the bottom of the cast on up to the base of the knitting needle. And when that's 1.5 inches, I'll come back and show you the next step. So now I've completed that initial 1.5 inches of the ribbing. So what I need to do next is I need to increase my knitting needle size. The way I'm going to do this is first I'm going to take my knitting needle with my working on it, or with my work on it, right, and still point it over towards the right, as if I was about to start knitting into it. But rather than grabbing my other smaller knitting needle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my other set of knitting needles and just grab either one of the points. So now when I look at my work, I essentially have, my smaller knitting needle over here in my left hand, and then my larger knitting needle size over here in my right hand that I'm actually going to begin knitting with. So for this row, I'm just going to knit every single stitch. And it doesn't actually matter which side of your work you just finished for that 1.5 inches in ribbing, because those first rows are completely identical on either side of the work. So I'm going to take my larger knitting needle size, and I'm going to go right into that first stitch as if to knit, and then just keep on knitting all the way across this row. So now when I finish going all the way across this row, I'm going to end up with no stitches left on my smaller knitting needle size. So now I'm just going to move this one off to the side. I don't need that knitting needle anymore. And now all my stitches are on my larger knitting needle size. So I just knit across that first row in the center portion of the hat. So when I turn my work to begin my next row, again, grabbing onto my other larger knitting needle here, I'm gonna purl across the whole back. So essentially what we're gonna be doing for this whole center portion is knit one row, then turn our work and purl one row. Turn our work, knit one all the way across, turn your work, purl all the way across. And you just keep on going back and forth between knitting a row, purling a row. Now I want to continue working those 2 rows over and over again until the center portion of my hat measures 4 inches. So for me, I have 1.5 inches of ribbing, and then I want 4 inches of that knit one row, then purl the next row after that. So my total length should be right around 5.5 inches before the next step. Now I finished working that center portion of my hat, and I'm ready to begin the decreases. So for this decrease setup row, I want to make sure I have my stitch markers ready. Again, here you can either use some of the pre-made stitch markers. I'll have some of these linked down below. I have metal ones and plastic ones here. Or if you don't already own stitch markers, you can also just take some pieces of yarn, tie it into a little loop, and that works perfectly as well. When we begin these decreases, we want to make sure we're about to work across one of our knitting rows. So I just finished going across, purling each stitch, then I turn my work, and now I kind of have like the outside of my hat facing out, right? This whole flat knit portion. So this is the side we're going to work all of our decreases on. So first for my decrease setup row, it says knit 1 stitch, then place a stitch marker. So I'm just going to take one of my stitch markers and place it right onto my right knitting needle. Now there's a set of little stars, and in between those 2 stars, it tells me my repeat that I'm going to continue working all the way across. So the repeat for my size is knit 14, work a knit 2 together, then place a stitch marker. So first I'm going to knit 14. And now next up, I need to do a knit 2 together. So what a knit 2 together is it's a knitting decrease where we're going to turn the next 2 stitches on our left knitting needle into just 1 stitch. So the way it works is instead of just putting your knitting needle into 1 stitch as if to knit, you want to put it into the base of the next 2 stitches on your left knitting needle as if to knit. So I'm going to take my right knitting needle point and go into the base of the next 2, starting over here on the left hand side, going over towards the right. So my knitting needle is going through both of those stitches, wrap my yarn around as I would for a knit stitch, and then pull through, slide both of those stitches off my left knitting needle. So I turn those 2 stitches into just 1. So to show it one more time, again, I'm going to take my right knitting needle point into the base of the next 2, going from left to right, wrap my yarn around, pull through. And that's a knit 2 together. So now I'm going to place a stitch marker, and again, I'm going to work that same repeat again. So I'm going to knit 14, knit 2 together. So first let me knit 14. And now again, just to show knit 2 together one more time, my right knitting needle point into the base of the next 2 stitches, wrap my yarn around, pull through, place a stitch marker. And I'm going to keep on repeating that knit 14, knit 2 together, place a stitch marker all the way across until you'll end up with 1 stitch remaining. So I'm going to place my last stitch marker and then knit the final stitch. Now I've gone all the way across that first decrease row, placed all my stitch markers, so I'm going to turn my work, and on the opposite side of my work, I'm going to purl all the way across. So anytime I get to one of these stitch markers, let me purl the first stitch first, then anytime I get to one of these stitch markers, I'm just going to pass it from my left to my right knitting needle. Then keep on purling, next stitch marker, pass it, keep on going all the way across. Now that I finished purling across, I'm going to turn my work. Now I'm ready for the 2 decrease repeat rows. So first, when I'm on the knit side of my work, the repeat I'm going to work is knit the first stitch, past the stitch marker, then I'm going to knit until 2 stitches before my next stitch marker, knit 2 together, past the stitch marker, knit until 2 stitches before my next stitch marker, knit 2 together, past the stitch marker, keep on repeating that in between each set, then knit the final stitch. Then I'm going to turn my work and I'm going to purl all the way across the back side. And then again, I would just work that same knit up until 2 stitches before, work a knit 2 together, all the way across over and over again, until I have the number of stitches in between each one of these center stitch markers that's specified in the pattern. Now for the size I'm knitting, I'm going to continue working those 2 repeat rows over and over again until I have a total of 7 stitches remaining in between each set of my stitch markers. Then I'll come back and I'll show you the final step, where we basically cast off the remaining stitches and then seam down the edge. So now on this final decrease row, what we're going to be doing is we're first going to be removing our stitch markers as we go along, and then within each set of stitch markers, we're going to be working multiple knit 2 togethers. So first, let me just knit this first stitch. I'm still going to knit my first and last stitch. I'm going to take off a stitch marker. So I have an odd number of stitches before my next stitch marker. So in this case, I'm going to knit the first stitch, then work knit 2 together each set of 2 stitches until my next stitch marker. So I'm going to do knit 2 together, knit 2 together, knit 2 together, take off my next stitch marker, then repeat that again. So I'm going to knit the first stitch, then continue working knit 2 togethers all the way across until the next stitch marker. And so if you're knitting one of the sizes that has an even number of stitches in between, in that case, you're just going to work the knit 2 togethers all the way across, except again, the first stitch of the row and the last stitch of the row. Knit that final stitch. Okay, so now I have the number of stitches that I need for my final kind of like a cast off here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break my yarn, and I always like to leave extra. So I'm going to leave about 12 inches or so and then cut my yarn. And now for this step, I'm going to need my tapestry needle. So I'm going to turn my work so that the purl bumps are facing me, kind of like the inside of the hat is facing me. And now what I want to do is, starting at the opposite end, I want to thread this tapestry needle through each one of those stitches. So starting on the end where the working yarn isn't coming out of, I'm going to go across and thread my tapestry needle and this piece of yarn through. And so I'm showing you right now the method of what it would look like if you were using straight knitting needles. Okay, so now if you were working on straight knitting needles, this is what you'd have. You just threaded your yarn all the way through the stitches. So now I'm going to slide my stitches off my knitting needle. The quicker way to do this, if you're using circular knitting needles like me, is you can pull on one circular needle so that they end up over here on the opposite side. And then it becomes a bit easier, because what you can essentially do is, as you slip each one onto the waste yarn, you can slide it off the knitting needle. So I'm just threading that piece of yarn through each one of the remaining stitches. And I'm going to pull on that strand to secure it. So now what it should look like when you get this nice and tight is almost like a little star there at the top where all the stitches are gathered around. So later on when we weave in the ends, we can make sure we get that nice and tight. But next up, what I'm going to be doing is seaming up this edge. So the seaming method that I use is called mattress stitch. So the way mattress stitch works is you want to have your work basically laying so that the right side of your hat or the outside of your hat is down towards the table, right? Purl bumps are up, and then you're going to fold in the 2 edges. So now your seam is going to go right up here. I like to start at the bottom of the cuff and go up towards the top of the hat. Now the exact seaming method is called mattress stitch. And what that is essentially we're going to go back and forth, one side to the other side, picking up one stitch in from either side. So let me show you what I mean. So now what I'm looking for when I work mattress stitch is on either side, I want to find the outermost stitch. So for example, if I look at this right side here, and you kind of have to roll your hand underneath your hat to keep it from curling in, you want to look for the outermost column, right? So this right here, these sets of V's are my outermost column going all the way up this side. Then if I just grab on to that outermost column, so with those sets of V's, and I stretch out my work, I can see that there's sets of bars in between that outermost stitch and the next set of stitches, right? So this would essentially be a column of knit stitches. So what I want to pick up on this side is these bars that are connecting the first stitch and that second stitch. So these are the bars I'm going to want to pick up. Now, if we look a little bit further up on the hat, it becomes a little bit easier to see up here because we don't have ribbing anymore. So up here, again, the first set of V's on that outer edge is going to be our first stitch. And then if we stretch out our work, I can see that there's little bars that are connecting the first set of V's, bar, next set of V's. So again, this is the bar I want to pick up. On the opposite side, it's going to work the exact same way. So here I have my column of V's going down the side, and then next to it, in this case we have a purl stitch, but what I want to look for is that little bar right in there that's connecting that column of V's to the next purl stitch. So I want to pick up kind of like the the rightmost bar within that purl stitch. Then again, as we get higher up into just the knit portion, it's a little bit easier to see again, right? We have that column of knit stitches, and then I kind of push my nail in right next to where that column is and stretch it out. And I can see that again, there's those bars. So the bar connecting that knit stitch and the next column of knit stitches. So those are the bars I'm going to pick up on either side. So what I have to seam with is I have my tapestry needle, and then about 30 inches or so, I always like to have extra, of a piece of yarn. So I'm just going to thread my tapestry needle. And now, as I mentioned before, I like to start at the cuff and go up towards the top of the hat. You can start on either side. I'm going to start over here on the right hand side. And again, I'm going to kind of unroll it, find that leftmost stitch or the furthest one towards the edge, and stretch it out. Now, when I first bring my yarn up, I'm just going to go kind of like this. These two right here are the cast on edge. So I'm just going to go one in, thread my yarn up, and I want to make sure I leave a little tail here. So I'm going to leave like 6 or 8 inches there. Now I'm going to go over to the opposite side. Again, stretch out my work. I have that column of stitches down the side. That's my first column. And I'm going to go to the next bar over. Now I'm going to go back over to the other side, stretch it out again, pick up the next bar going up there. And for right now, you don't have to pull them too tight. Now again, find the column on the side, pick up the bar. And I'm just going to go back and forth for about 1 inch or so just to start with. So now that I've done that little section, I'm going to hold onto my tail so that this one doesn't go anywhere when I tug on the yarn. And I'm just going to gently pull on the yarn so it tightens up that seam. Then I'm going to go for about another inch or so and again tighten up the seam. Now that I'm up into just the plain knit and purl section of my work, it's a little bit easier to see. So for example, I just picked up one on the right side, so I'm looking over here on the left side now. I'm going to find that outermost column stretch out my work, and find the next bar that I haven't picked up yet. Go back over to the other side. Again, find that outermost column, stretch it out, pick up the next bar. And you just want to make sure you're keeping it all the way aligned, all the way up to the top, and that nothing ends up offset. So every once in a while, I like to double check that there's not one side that has like a lot more fabric than the other side. If that does happen, you do just kind of have to skip one or two of those bars along one side to get it to match up again. So now I'm going to continue seaming all the way up this edge. Now I finished knitting and seaming up my hat, so the last few steps I want to show you here is first how I weave in my ends, and then also how to add a pom-pom if you're interested in adding one of those. So for my hat, I have a total of 4 ends, 2 at the bottom, 2 at the top. And the easiest way to weave them in is actually to use this seam that we created and weave them into the seam. So for example, if I took one of these ones down here at the bottom and threaded my tapestry needle with that yarn tail, now all I have to do is just take this yarn and just thread it back and forth, kind of like into the bulkiness of that seam. So I usually just go back and forth like 4 or 5 times. Then I can cut that yarn, and then I just move on to the next tail. So again, weave that one into that seam as well. Then at the top, for the one that's actually looped around the circle, so holding those stitches together, so that's this one for me. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it nice and tight just to make sure that top loop really closes up. Then for this one, because I want that top loop to stay closed up and I don't want those stitches to accidentally expand out further, I am going to tie a little bit of a knot for this one. So you can really choose anywhere around the circle to tie your knot. Just going to make sure I pull it nice and tight first. All right, so I'll use the strand right next to it and just tie a double knot right into that strand. Now, once I've done that, you can either use this tail to put on your pom-pom, or my pom-pom already has strings on it. So I'm just going to weave in this tail and then cut it as well. Now this last part is completely optional, but what I usually like to do is add a cute little pom-pom to the top of my hat. So I just chose kind of like one of the contrasting colors in this yarn and found another yarn that I had that matched pretty well. So I think that'll look really cute. And I used one of these pom-pom makers that I got off of Amazon to make this. So I used the size that's missing, which is the 6.8 centimeter size. So all of these linked down below if you're curious about them. I think they work really well. And so when I tie my pom-pom, I just leave on 2 extra long pieces of yarn. So this is the yarn I tied the pom-pom with. And now again, to add this pom-pom to my hat, I'm just going to use one of my tapestry needles and starting with one of those yarn tails, I go to the top of my hat and I find one side of that loop or the center circle at the top, going to one side with the first strand. Now I'm going to get the other strand. And now I'm going to go into the opposite side of that circle at the top. Now I go to the inside of my hat. And typically what I do for these is I don't want to tie them permanently onto the hat just in case someone wants to wash it or something like that, right? That way they can take the pom-pom off. So how I do this is I just tie it kind of like I'm tying a pair of shoes. Right, so I'm going to do like a double knot with a little bow. and then I only cut the strands just a little bit so that way if someone wants to re-add it to the hat again, they can do that later on. So there is my finished hat. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave them down below. And if you're new to my channel, don't forget to hit that red subscribe button. That way you stay up to date on all my future videos. I'll see you next time.